So let's start by talking about cancer as an example of a disease. 80 years ago, no one knew the molecular and cellular causes of cancer. But what people could see most clearly was the patterns of failure and incidence of cancer in populations. For example, in colon cancer, every 15% increase in age causes a doubling in cancer incidence. And in general, there's very clear patterns between the relationship between age and cancer incidence in populations. But at the same time, people could see that the molecular and cellular causes of cancer at a small scale within individuals is highly random. And so then each tumor often appears to be physiologically unique. And so the puzzle then is, how can we reconcile at the small scale the great randomness and variability in the molecular and cellular causes, and yet at the same time, the fact that we see very consistent regular patterns within populations. And in the 1940s, people could see these patterns and they saw them very clearly, but they didn't understand why they occurred. And then in the 1950s, some people had the idea of approaching this problem from a systems approach of reliability and failure. They said, well, let's suppose our body has multiple protections against disease. And so when you're born, you have these various protections in place. And as you get a little older, maybe one of the protections breaks down. And one of the protections will break down, but you're still okay because you have other protections in place. You get a little bit older, and another protection breaks down, and maybe you get a small tumor, a little polyp in your colon, but you still have other protections to keep that tumor from spreading, so it's not a cancerous disease. And it's only when the last protection breaks down that the tumor will then spread throughout your body and you have disease. And so in the 1950s, some mathematicians picked up this idea of a systems approach to reliability and failure, and they worked out the mathematics of cancer progression in order to try to understand how we could reconcile the small-scale randomness and variability in individuals with the great regularity of the relationship between age and disease in populations. And they came up with a theory that could potentially reconcile those observations. But actually, this theory in the 1950s and the 1960s really didn't have much effect because the biologists said, well, that's a nice theory and maybe it explains the facts, but we don't really know what these stages are. You're just making this up. What are these mechanisms? We don't know what you're talking about. And so no one really paid much attention to this idea. And the answer came back and said, well, maybe it's genetic mutations in cells. As you get older, your cells acquire mutations and you keep on acquiring mutations, and each mutation is associated with a breakdown of one of these protective mechanisms. And so that could possibly reconcile what we see. And the biologists said, well, that's nice, that could be. But in fact, in the 1950s and the 1960s, no one really thought that genetics was important for cancer. It was true that you could see in some families that there were inherited genetic mutations and those were associated with cancer, but that was thought to be relatively rare. And in most cancer cases, people didn't see any association between genetics and cancer. And so people thought genetics really wasn't important. And so again, this idea really had no consequence. Then in 1969, a guy named Ashley had a clever idea. He said, let's suppose that this idea of multi-stage progression is true. You have multiple protections that break down over the course of your lifetime. And let's suppose that the breakdown really is genetic mutations that happen in your cells as you get older. Then here's how we can test the theory. We can find families where there's an inherited genetic mutation which predisposes to disease. And if this theory is correct, what that means is that if you inherit a genetic mutation, then one of your protective mechanisms is knocked out at birth because we're associating genetic mutations with the knockout of a protective mechanism. So you have a certain set of protective mechanisms. You inherit a mutation at birth, so one of those mechanisms is knocked out, and you have fewer protective mechanisms. And so there's two predictions. One is if you have fewer protective mechanisms, then the incidence of disease will be higher. That's an obvious prediction. And the second prediction of this theory is that if you have fewer protective mechanisms, that the slope that relates age to cancer incidence will be lower, because the mathematical theory showed that the more protective mechanisms you have, the greater the slope of the relation between age and failure or cancer incidence. So if you inherit a mutation, you reduce the number of protective mechanisms, then that slope between age and cancer incidence should decline. And so Ashley then went and found families where there was an inherited mutation that predisposed the family to colon cancer. That was clear. And then those people did have a higher incidence of cancer. Again, that's fairly obvious. But in addition, those people who inherited the mutation had a lower slope in the relationship between age and the onset of disease than those people in the population who did not have this mutation. They had more protective mechanisms according to the theory, and in fact, they had a greater slope in the relation between age and disease. And I've actually reanalyzed those data in more detail, and the decline in slope for the inherited cases is exactly what you would predict if the inherited genetic mutation is a knockout of one of the protective mechanisms, according to this mathematical theory for multi-stage progression for disease. Now, that was in 1969, and it took many years before people actually figured out what the genetic mutations actually were and what the cellular and molecular mechanisms were that were associated with those mutations. But we now know quite a bit about that. And this idea of multiple protections, that our bodies have these multiple protections at birth, and you get the breakdown of those protections over your lifetime, that actually is the predominant explanation that allows us to connect the molecular and cellular changes that happen with an individual to the great regularity in the pattern of failure within the population that's reflected in the relationship between age and disease incidence. Of course, there's a lot we don't understand, but this is really the dominant view that we have today. And so with that general background about the relationship between how our bodies might be designed to protect us and how failure occurs, I want to make some more general points, a point which I'm going to call the paradox of robustness. And here's the idea. So suppose our bodies have multiple protections, which seems to be the case in regard to cancer, at least. And then evolutionarily, imagine that we add an additional protective mechanism. Now, this might be an error-correcting feedback in a classic engineering control theory sense. It might be a repair mechanism or some other protective mechanism. We often would call that robustness because it protects the system from failure. And let's think about the evolutionary consequences of adding an additional protective mechanism to such a system. If you add another protective mechanism to the system, then the protections that were in place previously, they become less important. Suppose that they're a little less reliable, they break down a little easier than they did before. That's going to be okay because now you have another protective mechanism or repair system that can correct errors, repair damage. And so you're not going to get failure or disease. You have a protection. And so the essential point is when you take a system, an evolutionary system, and you add an additional protective mechanism, you reduce the pressure on the reliability and performance of the existing mechanisms that were already present. And it's essentially an evolutionary law that when you reduce the evolutionary pressure on the performance of the component of a biological system, that component tends to decay over time. It will accumulate more deleterious genetic mutations, which reduce the performance of the system, the component. And perhaps the system will substitute a cheaper, less reliable component because it doesn't matter so much. And so you might as well use something that's cheaper in place. Now, from an engineering point of view, there's nothing very interesting or surprising about having a system and noticing that you have a particular component of the system that you could use a cheaper, less reliable component, and it wouldn't really affect the system's performance very much, then you would do it. You would save the money, and it wouldn't really cause a greater degree of failure. And so that would be a better design. But in biology, this idea that adding a corrective mechanism, error-correcting feedback or repair to the system, which clearly is beneficial to the system as a whole in terms of reducing disease, might have consequences for the lower level components in terms of making them less reliable over evolutionary time as they accumulate mutations or cheaper, lower performing components get substituted in. And so let's think about what might happen evolutionarily then. We imagine that we add an error correction to a system. The components then tend to decay. This is what I call the paradox of robustness. The system becomes more robust, more protected, but the components tend to decay in performance and reliability. Now, once you add a corrective system and the components tend to decay as they equilibrate to the new selective pressures, you cannot go back. If you took away this protective mechanism, the components that were previously in place that protected the system have now decayed and don't perform so well, and the system would fail at a very high rate. And so when you add a protective mechanism and the system relaxes in response to that, then that's like a unidirectional ratchet in evolutionary history where you tend never to go back. Then you might imagine the layering of another protective mechanism on top of that and a relaxation of the components below. And over evolutionary time, I imagine this sort of layering and relaxation as being an essentially inevitable aspect of evolutionary design. And there's some consequences of this. First of all, if that's how our bodies are designed over evolutionary time, you might imagine that the regulatory controls in our bodies might be rather complicated because you're getting a high-level protective mechanism and a decay, but those mechanisms don't go away, and so on. And this layering is going to lead to a complex wiring within our bodies. And I like to say when we look at the genomes, in fact, and the regulatory architectures that occur within our bodies in terms of genetic interactions, they seem to be overwired. The regulatory controls seem to be dense and more wired than an engineer would build. This is something that Randy Nesse pointed out. And so maybe one of the causes of the overwiring of our genomes is this paradox of robustness. Also, when the components, the lower level components tend to decay a bit, this will tend to lead to particular kinds of fragility in the system. So the system may become more robust in some ways, but when you have a lot of components that are decaying and interacting in this more complex interaction, this leads to particular kinds of fragility and failure. And I've done some studies of this sort theoretically, and it seems to be so. So overall, this is just a theoretical idea about evolutionary history, but I feel like the logic is so simple and so inevitable, then there must be a lot about the way our bodies are designed, which follow this process, and a lot about how our bodies fail in disease, which is a consequence of this process. The same may also be true for human organizations and institutions that are designed in the same kind of haphazard way that evolutionary systems are designed. Instead of a clear, rational engineering design, many human institutions it's sort of evolved by this stepwise process without a real clear engineering design. So I feel like the idea potentially has a lot of consequence, although again, at present, it's really primarily a theoretical idea. There's some little hints we can see that maybe this would work, but at present, I just put it out there as a way that we might connect this engineering approach to understanding evolutionary design and failure.